Welcome to Chapter 2. In this chapter, we're going to take a look at the economic external environment. This is a really important chapter, and not only for your studies in business, but also it will help you in your own personal life. The study of economics is really an analytical science that really helps us understand the world around us. By having an understanding of economics, you as a student can help better make decisions about your future, perhaps. Questions like, is now the time to change jobs? Is now the time to ask for a raise? What are the employment prospects expected to be when I graduate from university? Should I buy that new car now, or should I wait until the summer? All these type of questions can be answered by looking at the economic external environment. For businesses, similarly, it's important to understand the economic environment within which they are working. They will need to make decisions about expanding plants, or whether they should be increasing prices, or what happens if the economy slows down, what will happen with interest rates, what's expected to happen with interest rates. Should I take out that loan now? Should I fix my interest rate or let it float up and down? All sorts of critical business decisions are based on an understanding of the economic environment. So in this chapter, we're going to take a look at what economics is and take a look at how all parts of the economy are linked together. We'll take a look at the different economic systems that are present in the world today. We're going to take a look at the four common types of market structure, and then we'll get into some microeconomics and start taking a look at the concepts of demand and supply and how prices are set in a free market economy. We're also going to take a look at some of the economic measures, such as growth in the economy, employment, as well as inflation and price stability. We're going to revisit a little bit of the information that you learned about Bank of Canada in Chapter 17, and we'll talk a little bit more about how the Bank of Canada uses monetary policy and how the federal governments use fiscal policy to help regulate the economy in Canada. And lastly, we'll take a look at some of the trends that are happening in the economic environment today. So what is economics? Economics is really an analytical science, and it's really the study of how society uses scarce resources to produce and distribute both goods and services. When we talk about economics, there's really two subsets, I guess, of economics. One is called macroeconomics, and that's the part of economics that focuses on the economy as a whole. So it takes a look at things like growth in the economy, unemployment in the economy, inflation rates in the economy, etc. So it's a broad picture of what's happening in the economy. Microeconomics is that area of economics that really focuses on individual decisions within the economy. Some of those decisions might be, should I ask for a raise now? Should I buy that car now? For businesses, it might be, what price should I set my product at? How should I price my product? Should I be expanding production now, or should I be contracting expansion now? So those are some of the microeconomic decisions that a business person might have to make. Economics answers really four basic questions. So the study of economics helps us decide what will be produced in the economy, how much will be produced to meet the demand for a certain product, how will it be produced, and for who will it be produced. So these are all questions that every economy needs to answer. And some of these decisions are made by the marketplace, some are made by the government, or sometimes in both. In Canada, we have what's called a mixed economic system. And so, really, the government as well as the free market system helps determine the answers to these four basic economic questions. And we'll see a little bit more about that later on in the chapter. To understand the economics and to understand business, we need to take a look at something that's called the factors of production. And these are kind of the ingredients list or the building blocks of any business. So to produce a successful business, we need resources. And there's basically 5 categories of resources that are combined together to form a successful business. The first of those factors of production are called is called natural resources. So natural resources includes things like land and natural resources, commodities. So that would be farmland, forests, any mineral deposits, oil deposits that are present in the economy. So these are the natural resources that are used to produce any business, or that's used in the production of any goods and services. Labor is the physical effort of workers as they convert some of those natural resources into products and services that are designed or desired by the people in the economy. When we talk about capital here, we're really talking about the tools, machinery, equipment, our factories, distribution services, trucks, and that sort of thing, that is combined to produce successful goods and services or distribute those successful goods and services. Here we sometimes in finance courses we talk about capital being money, but in this concept money itself is not a factor of production. It is a means to buy other capital items. So rather than thinking of money here as being capital, as you may have learned in some of your finance courses, here money is just a means to buy other factors of production. The fourth factor of production is called knowledge. And so really this is the skills, the minds that are able to create new products. This is the one of the backbones of the factors of production. This is the talents and skills of the workforce. And this knowledge is becoming more and more important as a factor of production because as we see there are more innovative products that are being created and more complex products that are needed. So knowledge is really a key factor of production, and some say knowledge is one of the most important factors of production. Entrepreneurship is that entrepreneurial thinking that is able to combine all of the other factors of production and combine them together to produce a successful business. So keep in mind, all of these key components are required, all these factors of production are required to operate a successful business in any economy. Canada is fortunate because we have an abundance of each of those 5 factors of production. Some countries may have a lot of natural resources, labor and capital, and knowledge. For instance, China, until recently, has a large base of those 4 key factors of production, but perhaps lacked a little bit on the entrepreneurship side. However, that is certainly changing as we've been seeing over the last little while, so that the entrepreneurship in China has certainly increased and producing lots more positive results in that economy. This is really a busy slide, but it's really meant to show that uh, uh, economics really is a circular flow in the economy, really between businesses and households, with the government interactions along the way. So, for instance, let's start. You can start anywhere because it's a circular flow. We can start by with households. Households are consumers who spend money to buy goods and services that they desire. That drives business revenues, and businesses then produce those goods and services which flow back to consumers. At the same time, while businesses are generating revenues from consumers spending money on purchasing their goods and services, they also incur costs. Costs, for any of the inputs, the natural resources, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, and the knowledge they need to pay for those inputs, and they also need to pay. They also pay money back to the households in the form of labor. So that money goes back to the households, and it keeps spinning and spinning. This whole circular flow. In the middle of it is the government, and the government has many interactions both with households as well as businesses. They serve as a regulatory agent on the good production of goods and services, what can be produced, how it must be produced, standards for production to protect the interests of Canadians. They are also a key tax collector, so they will collect taxes both from the households or consumers as well as the businesses themselves. The government is also a large purchaser of goods and services from businesses, so it will generate revenue for businesses as well. So this whole interaction is really governed by the government, and all three levels of government, federal, provincial, and municipal levels, all interact in this circular flow of what we call the economy. In understanding the economy, it's important to understand the different types of economic systems that exist throughout the world today. So a nation's economic system is really the combination or the set of policies, laws, and choices made by the government to establish the systems that determine what goods and services are produced and how resources are allocated within the economy. So we're going to take a look at four primary economic systems that exist in the world today. That include the market economies, command economies, socialism, and the mixed economy that Canada has. So these are the four primary economic systems that exist in the world today. Each of these, the major difference between these is how the economy and the government manage the factors of production that we learned about a little bit while ago. So it will base its economic decisions based on how to allocate those resources to best satisfy the needs of society, as well as to choose what goods and services are produced, what the prices will be, who will produce those, and how goods and services will be distributed within the economy. So let's take a look at each of those economic systems. Market economy is really sometimes known as capitalism or the private enterprise system or free enterprise system. So those are all different names for what we call the market economy. And it's based on open competition in the marketplace and private ownership of the factors of production. So businesses and individuals own the factors of production or all the resources in a market economy. In fact, in a pure market economy, all the factors of production are owned privately, and the government doesn't have a lot of role in regulating or setting prices or controlling economic activity at all. So a market economy guarantees certain economic rights to businesses and individuals. For instance, it guarantees the right to own property. It guarantees the right to make a profit. It guarantees the right to make free choices. And it guarantees the right to compete. The main incentive in a market economy is profit. So businesses as well as individuals are motivated by that profit or the accumulation of wealth. In a market economy, competition is good for both businesses as well as consumers. Competition in a market economy leads to more innovative, diverse products. It controls prices, keep prices down. It forces businesses to remain competitive, operate efficiently, and in turn, the profits that are generated will entice other businesses to enter the economy and set up and start operating, which again forces everybody else to be more competitive and keep prices low. So in a market economy, the government doesn't have a lot of role in regulating or controlling the economy as well. The trend over, I don't know, the last 50 years or so has been for other economic systems to move towards more of a market economy. There are probably no pure capitalistic economic systems in the world today. Probably the closest that we would see would be the United States, even though they do have some government intervention. So it's not a pure capitalist or pure market economy, but it's the closest that we would see in the world today. At the other end of the spectrum is something that's called the command economy. You may have heard it called communism to describe a command economy. In the command economy is really a planned economy or central planning. And in a command economy, the government virtually owns all the resources and controls all the factors of production. So it's the government that is the main economic force, whereas in a market economy, competition is the main economic force. So the government will set decisions on what will be produced, how much will be produced, who will do the production, and who will have access to certain goods and services. Some of the problems in a command economy we've seen are it's very difficult to plan consumption or plan the resource allocation. And it sometimes results in a shortage of even some of the basic needs or basic items that a society needs. Today, probably China and Cuba are the closest examples of a command economy, although those are changing as well. China has really taken steps to move towards a more free enterprise system, whereas Cuba and perhaps North Korea are the best examples of a command economy as we sit today. Socialism is another economic system in which the basic industries are owned by the government. So, and the private sector does own some factors of production, but there's a large amount of government control. So in a socialist state, the bigger industries are still controlled by the government, transportation, communications, utilities, and they still control many of the factors of production, but they do allow smaller businesses to exist and are privately owned. In a socialist state, we often see a very high level of social programs, unemployment benefits, welfare programs, healthcare programs. And to fund those in a socialist state, we see very high levels of taxation, often see very high levels of unemployment as well. Sweden is probably one of the best examples of socialist economic system in the world today. Many countries, including Canada and the United Kingdom, are what we call mixed economies. So basically, in a mixed economy, many of the factors of production are privately owned, so businesses and individuals own the factors of production. However, there's a large amount of government control, and in a mixed economy, some industries will be owned and controlled by the government itself. So, for instance, in Canada, the mail system is controlled by the government. We have organizations or crown corporations that provide that do a lot of regulation in the economy. The Office of Superintendent of Financial Institutions really regulates the financial services industry. We have the Canadian CRTC, who regulates broadcasting within Canada. There is a while the profit motive still exists, much like in a market economy, there still is a large level of government control, and in Canada through crown corporations, some of the factors of production are owned by the government of Canada. Some of the trends in Canada are, even though it's a mixed economy, is that there is some deregulation of industry. So we're seeing deregulation or reduction in the amount of regulation in airline industry, banking, trucking industry, which allow businesses to be more competitive. This slide is a good review of the four different economic systems in the world, from the command economy, market economy, socialism, and mixed economy. And it compares each of them in terms of ownership, control of the markets, worker incentives, management of enterprises, as well as a little bit of a forecast for 2020. We'll see that the command economy really doesn't have a lot of potential for growth. As we said earlier, many economies are switching from the command economy and going to more of a market economy, private enterprise system. So this is a good review for each of the four economic systems. As we mentioned earlier, one of the characteristics of a free market environment or economic system is that suppliers have the right to compete with one another. And so in a free market, there are four basic types of market structure. And when we're talking market structure, we're talking about the number of suppliers in any given market. So there are four types of market structures. The first being perfect competition. In perfect competition, there's a large number of smaller businesses that are supplying goods in the market, and the products that are being supplied by each of those suppliers are essentially the same. The products don't differentiate significantly from one supplier to the other. In perfect competition, there's a lot of good information, or everybody has relatively easy access to information about other buyers and other sellers and prices and sources of supply and that sort of thing. So there's a free flow of information, and it's relatively easy to enter that market. So there's not a lot of barriers to entry into perfect competition. Because the products are basically identical from one supplier to the other, any supplier doesn't have a lot of impact or control over the price. It's difficult, if not impossible, to differentiate their product from another supplier's. So the forces of demand and supply, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes, really dictates what the price is. One of the best examples of perfect competition would be suppliers of wheat in Canada. So that wheat cannot be differentiated from one supplier to another. The second type of market structure is something called monopolistic competition. In monopolistic competition, similarly to perfect competition, there's a large number of suppliers or businesses in the market. However, the products that are produced in the market are not exactly the same. They are close substitutes, but suppliers try to differentiate their product or service offering from one another. In monopolistic competition, too, it is relatively easy to enter the market. Companies or markets such as fast food or restaurants, clothing, many businesses in Canada today really are operating in a monopolistic competition type of environment. So there's a large number of suppliers, and the product is not exactly the same. So each supplier in that market tries to differentiate their product from their competition. And if they're able to differentiate their product, our product is better than competitor B's on service or on quality, or we have more features. Each of the suppliers in monopolistic competition can gain a little bit control over the price that they sell their goods and services. Whereas in perfect competition, each supplier really has no control over the price. In monopolistic competition, if you're successful in setting your product apart or differentiating your product from your competitors, you do gain a little bit of price control. So we see a lot of heavy competition in monopolistic competition. We see, fast food outlets that are, focusing on providing healthier alternatives, perhaps, to the traditional burger as a way to set themselves out apart from the others. Other businesses might try and stand apart from their competition by offering a better quality product or perhaps a better service than the competition. The third market structure is something that's called oligopoly. Oligopoly is a little bit different from the other two that we've talked about in terms that there are a relatively small number of suppliers. So there might be 2 or 3 or 5 producers or suppliers in an oligopoly. And in an oligopoly, there's usually some fairly large barriers to entry. It can be very difficult to get into that market because there might be some very large capital requirements to get into that market. So an example of an oligopoly here in Manitoba might be our television services. We have Shaw and MTS TV that are dominating the market here in Winnipeg. So each one of them tries to compete with the other. Steel producers are another business in the oligopoly. Oil companies would probably be an oligopoly. Few suppliers and large barriers of entry to get into that market. So in oligopoly, there's a limited number of suppliers, and because there's only a few suppliers, each competitor really watches what the other does. If one competitor jacks up its price, it probably will lose sales to its competition. So companies in an oligopoly really watch each other closely for any changes in product or service that they're trying to offer to stand apart, or price changes. And often they will copy what the other companies might be doing. There's been a lot of antitrust legal action in the oligopoly market because sometimes there's a little bit of collusion that goes on, and different suppliers will coordinate their pricing and output decisions, which is really illegal. It's contrary to the Competition Act here in Canada. So there's a lot of government watching companies in the oligopoly market. And the final is market structure is a pure monopoly. And a pure monopoly differs from the other in that there's only one company or one supplier of that good or service. Because there's only one company in that market, the company really has free rein in setting prices. In pure monopoly, there's pretty large or significant barriers to entry to get into that market. And there's really no competition in pure monopoly. A company in Manitoba that would operate in pure monopoly environment would be our Autopac, MPIC, Manitoba Public Insurance Corporation. It is the sole supplier of automobile insurance in Manitoba. Because pure monopoly really has no competition, there tends to be a lot of government intervention, government regulation of that industry. Manitoba Hydro is another example of pure monopoly, and anytime that they want to change prices, they have to appear before the Public Utilities Board and actually make an application to change their prices. Same thing similarly with Autopac. So there tends to be a lot of government interaction or involvement and regulation in pure monopoly to protect the interests of Canadian consumers. So let's take a look at a supply curve. This is an example of a supply curve in the market, and so this relates to the quantity of goods that would be supplied by businesses at any given price. So here on the y-axis we see the price going from low to high, and along the x-axis we have the quantity supplied going from low to high as well. So suppliers, if price is high, if the price was high, they would want to supply a large amount of goods and services. So if the price is high, the profit potential is high, they were going to want to supply a large amount of goods and services. And if the price falls, the price is low, the quantity supplied would be fairly small. So we typically see a supply curve which shows that as prices rise, the quantity supplied is higher, which makes sense. If the in a free enterprise system, if the main motivation is profit, the potential for higher profit means that businesses would want to supply more. So let's take a look at the demand curve. The demand curve represents the quantity demanded by consumers in a free market or free enterprise system. So again, similarly on the y-axis we've got the price low to high, and along the x-axis we've got the quantity demanded from low to high. And so for the demand curve, if prices are high, the quantity demanded is going to be fairly low, because prices go up, prices are high, consumers will not want as many of that good or as much of that service. As the price tends to fall, however, the quantity demanded increases. So as the price of a bottle of Coke, if it was $5 for a bottle of Coke, the quantity demanded would be pretty low. But as the price of a bottle of Coke falls, consumers will demand more of it and purchase more of it. So what we see is a demand curve that slopes downwards to the right. So on this slide, we see an overlay of the supply and demand curves. So our demand curve is represented here by the red line, and the blue line represents our supply curve. And so what happens in a free market economy, particularly in a purely competitive market, is that the point where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded becomes the equilibrium point. So in our example here, the equilibrium point where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded is 700 units. And the price at which that happens is $80 per item. So in a purely competitive market, supply equals demand. There's no shortage, there's no surplus of goods. Equilibrium price is $80. If, however, suppliers or the price was set at $120, let's say, for instance, at a price of $120, suppliers try to set that price. They want to supply more because the profit potential is more, so they might be willing to provide 950 items at that price. However, demand for that good and service at $120 is only 400 units. So suppliers want to sell 950. The consumers will only purchase 400 units. So we end up with a surplus in the number of units in the market. And when there's a surplus, suppliers will want to try and move that surplus. So what they'll do is they'll decrease the price, and the price will eventually set back at the equilibrium point. So in a free market environment, the forces of demand and supply will dictate what the price is. Now, the supply and demand curves in a free market environment are not static. They will change as other forces, other variables change. The supply and demand curves might take a shift to the right or to the left. For instance, our demand curve might take a shift to the right if there's a change in customer income. If personal income taxes go down, consumers have more disposable income. So the demand curve might take a shift to the right, which would result in increased prices. If there's a hot new item on the market, demand increases, the demand curve will take a shift to the right as well. If the number of buyers increases in the market, that will also force an increase to the right. If consumers are nervous about inflation or the economy, that might decrease demand, and we might see the demand curve shifting to the left as well. Similarly, a supply curve is not static as either. It will sometimes move to the right or left, and that will have an effect on prices in the market as well. So as the costs of production come down for suppliers, perhaps there's less taxes, perhaps there's new technology making the product cheaper to produce, the supply curve might shift to the right, and because suppliers can make more profit, so they want to supply more of that particular good or service, shifting the curve to the right. What that will do is drive the price down in the market. So there's a lot of things that will affect those demand and supply curves in any free market environment. Here we see some of the effects of changes in demand. As demand shifts to the right, um, we will see typically an increase in the prices as demand goes up, and as demand goes down, we see a fall in the price as well. You can review this slide and stop and think about what would happen in the market if some of these external forces come into being, how that would affect the demand, how that would affect the supply, and consequently how it would affect the price in the free market environment. So take some time and think through some of these changes and factors, and make sure you understand the resulting impact on the quantity demanded and quantity supplied, and ultimately the price. I want to take a little bit of a step backwards and take a look at the big picture view of the economy, and particularly three macroeconomic goals. So these are goals for any economy, and many government decisions and policies are set based on how they will influence these macroeconomic main goals. So there's three main macroeconomic goals that we're going to talk about. First of all, we're going to talk about economic growth, full employment, and price stability. Achieving each of these three macroeconomic goals can lead to greater wealth, higher standard of living, and a higher quality of life for citizens in any given country. So let's take a look at each of those main goals for the economy. So when we talk about a strong economy in Canada, for instance, we typically see that businesses are doing well. They are selling more in goods and services. Their revenues are increasing. Their profits are increasing. That allows them to hire more people, so we see the unemployment rate going down. Wages are strong, and there's more revenue for the government in form of taxes, because revenues are going up, wages are going up to provide goods and services for people in the economy, versus when there's a weak economy. Demand in the economy is sluggish or slowing down. We see business profits declining. We see businesses laying off workers, which increases the unemployment rate. We see wages fall or remain static. Not a lot of increase in wages happening. We see government revenues decline because the tax base is diminishing, and consequently we may see a budget deficit operated by the government. A budget deficit means the expenses of the government exceed the revenue base. It's important to understand the business cycle in any given economy. And the business cycle is the level of economic activity that happens in any given economy. And there's no set time frame for this business cycle. Sometimes the business cycle is very quick. Sometimes takes a long time to go through the entire cycle. But let's take a look at the business cycle. So at this point, the economy is very strong. So we see businesses making lots of money. There's high demand in the economy, um, and sometimes the demand is such that it is causing a shortage of goods and services because businesses cannot supply quickly enough the amount demanded in the economy. So in when the economy is very strong, we start seeing bond prices going up because businesses are doing well. Um, Oftentimes, interest rates are at a low, and because in a strong economy, the demand is sometimes exceeding the supply, we start to see inflation creep in. So prices start going up because demand is exceeding the supply. As we enter into a decline in the level of production or a weakness in the economy, we start to see the quantity demanded for goods and services declining. We start to see business profits decreasing. We start to see share prices decreasing. We start to see perhaps prices going down as competitors try to entice consumers to buy their products. Often we will see interest rates also declining as a government policy because they're trying to stimulate demand in the economy. A, a, a period where we have two or more quarters of negative growth in the economy is something that we call a recession. In as we go through a period of contraction or a period of recession, the economy then may start to pick up. So we start seeing demand increasing again, and the economy is starting to grow. When economy starts to grow, business profits start increasing again, share prices start going up as well. And as we reach the peak again, we start seeing some upward pressure on interest rates, and we start to see perhaps some inflation starting to creep in again, and we go through the cycle again and again. So it's important as a business person to understand at what point in the business cycle are we, because you might, if economic forecasts suggest that we're going to go into a period of slower economic growth or recession, you might defer building a new plant or buying that new piece of machinery. Similarly, if you're a consumer and the economy's been very, very good, but the forecast is that the economy will start to slow down, you may be in fear of losing your job, or prices going up significantly, so you might defer purchasing that brand new car until the economy starts to improve again. So having an understanding of where we are in the business cycle is really important. Canada's business, in the business cycle today, where we see some pretty strong economic growth in Canada. We see very low interest rates, which is spurring demand for goods and services. Inflation right now is fairly moderate, so it'll be interesting to see what happens in the business cycle going forward over the next. So some concepts in the business cycle. A boom is when the economy is growing quickly, it's strong, lots of jobs, lots of growth, economic prosperity. Recession is two or more quarters of a decline in gross domestic product, and we'll talk about that concept in a second. You've heard of the concept of a depression, and I think the last Great Depression that happened in Canada was in the 1930s. And so this is a very long, prolonged recession. And it can have crippling effects on the economy. And a recovery is when the economy starts to grow again. So there are different ways to evaluate or measure where the economy is in the business cycle. So we're going to take a look at three primary economic indicators, which can tell us where we are in the business cycle. The first is gross domestic product. The second is the unemployment rate, and the third is price indexes. And if you watch the news, you'll hear that most newscasts will talk about GDP, unemployment rate, and price indexes. The gross domestic product measures the total value of goods and services produced in Canada in a given year. So it is how much goods and services being produced in Canada in a given year. This would exclude any production that Canadian companies might have overseas. So if there's a multinational Canadian corporation that has a plant in the United States, a measure of GDP would exclude the production of that plant outside of Canada. Productivity is the total output of goods and services produced by or provided by the total labor hours, and is a measure of the health of economy. If economy is very productive, output of goods and services is high compared to the total labor hours used to produce those goods and services. Gross domestic product can have a huge impact on the standard of living and the quality of life in Canada. So if we take a look at Canada's GDP growth rate over a period of time, we can see some increases, which would represent a strong economy here, and we also see some decreases in GDP, which would represent a weakness in the economy. In fact, here we'd probably see a recession that happened in 2009, 2000, in early 2010. Canada's GDP has been growing by around the 2% mark throughout 2012. 2 to 3% is probably a good growth rate per quarter in Canada. So we've started to see a little bit of sluggishness, although we certainly haven't entered a recessionary period like we did in 2009 in Canada. Unemployment rate is the percent of the labor force that is looking for work but cannot find work at any given point in time. So as we said, a signal of a strong economy is low unemployment. And typically, we will see economists consider employment to be at full employment when about 94 to 96% of the population has a job, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. This chart shows the unemployment rates in Canada over the last couple of years. So right now we're sitting at about 7.1%, and we've been hovering around the 7% mark over the last year or so. So unemployment is fairly low in Canada at the current time. We've seen unemployment rates, as we came off, we're in the recession, we're approaching the 9% mark. Now we're down to 7%. So as we said, the unemployment rate is a percentage of labor force that is looking for work, but they're unable to find work at any given time. So typically typically economists will consider full employment when about 94 to 96% of those who are looking for jobs are actually working. And the reason is that there's always going to be some level of normal unemployment in Canada. And there are various types of unemployment in any economy. And so let's talk about the four types of unemployment. Frictional unemployment really is short-term unemployment, and it's really not related to the business cycle at all. In any society, we have people who leave a job and they're waiting to start a new job at any given point in time. So there's a lag. They may be unemployed for short periods of time while they're looking for a new job or starting a new job, or students are graduating and so they're entering the market for the first time. This is normal and will always be present. So there'll always be an element of frictional unemployment in the economy. The second type of unemployment is something that's called structural unemployment. And again, it's not related to where we are in the business cycle. And this really is involuntary unemployment. So typically we see structural unemployment when there's a mismatch between the skills that are demanded by employers and the skills that workers have. So, for instance, as the birth rates decline, we see less of a demand for teachers, and so some teachers may be out of work because of structural changes in the society or in the country. To help counter elements of structural unemployment, sometimes the government will come in and introduce re-employment programs to change or increase the skill set of its workers to reduce the structural element of unemployment. The third type of unemployment is directly related to where we are in the business cycle, and we call it cyclical unemployment. So this is due to economic downturn. So perhaps we're entering a recession, businesses start laying off people, which increases the unemployment rate in Canada. And this is probably the most serious form of unemployment in Canada. Right now, the cyclical unemployment rate is very small. We see we're getting very close to full employment. So the element of cyclical unemployment in Canada is fairly low right now. The last type of unemployment is seasonal unemployment. And that is, again, normal. It's not related to the business cycle. And it occurs due to changes in the season. For instance, we don't need lifeguards on Lake Winnipeg during the winter months. So those people that are employed as lifeguards on Lake Winnipeg would be out of work for certain months during the year, being seasonal unemployment. Same thing with construction workers. We see a larger seasonal unemployment during the winter months per se. So there are various types of ways to measure unemployment in Canada. The third macroeconomic goal is price stability. And price stability relates to keeping inflation down. You've probably heard the term inflation. And in an inflationary environment, the prices of goods and services increases over a period of time. The opposite of inflation is something called deflation or disinflation. Disinflation means prices are slowing down. So the increases in price are slowing down, whereas deflation means prices are actually declining. In Canada, we measure the level of inflation by something that's called the CPI, or Consumer Price Index. So the Consumer Price Index is a an indicator of the level of inflation. So think of Statistics Canada going out, and they've got a shopping basket of about 600 goods or services that are used by the average Canadian family. And so they take those 600 goods and services and they price them out on a monthly basis. And they total up that price, and that forms a base. Uh, then they will do the same thing the following month and look at the total price of that shopping cart of 600 goods and services. And if it has gone up, they will measure the change in the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, from one time to another. And the difference between the CPI at one point in time to another is or the rate of increase is called the inflation rate. Currently, the base rate is for the Consumer Price Index is 100, which is a base year of 2002 prices. And then every month, Statistics Canada will measure the Consumer Price Index. So, what happens when prices go up? So, as the price of goods and services starts going up, the purchasing power that Canadians have declines, because we can't buy with the same number of dollars that we have in our pocket. We can't buy as many goods and services, so we start to see a declining purchase power. So price increases leads to a decline in the purchasing power of the Canadian dollar. With inflation, if the purchasing power goes down, consumers cannot buy as much goods and services, hence business profits start going down. The gross domestic product will start to decline. We may see an increase in unemployment rates because businesses are not selling as sufficient goods and services to hire as many people, so they may start laying off people. So we will start to see unemployment going up in periods of high inflation. So it's important to understand how gross domestic product, unemployment, and inflation measured by the Consumer Price Index are all related. This slide just gives some of the definitions that you should be familiar with. So let's take a look at the historical inflation rate in Canada. Inflation in Canada has been fairly well controlled. You'll be taking a look at a Bank of Canada video, and the Bank of Canada tries to keep inflation or increases in prices, in this area, the 1.5% mark, the 2% mark. So inflation has been fairly low in Canada, and where we have seen periods of very high inflation rate. In fact, inflation in Canada in 1920 was about 21%, so prices were going up by about 21% per year, which had a significant impact on the standard of living and the quality of life in Canada, because goods and services were no longer being able to be afforded by Canadians. So keeping inflation rate stable and low is good for the Canadian economy. Inflation in itself is not bad. What's important is to have a predictable, stable level of inflation. It's a lot easier to plan from a business purpose if you know you can expect prices to go up by 1.5% per year. It's when prices all of a sudden go up by 20% one year and then they fall 15% from one year to the other that makes it very difficult to plan and make business decisions. We can also take a look at Canada's inflation rate, which is about 1.5% to other countries in the world. Look at India, current inflation rate about over 7%. And so our inflation rate in Canada has been lower than some of the other economic developed countries in throughout the world. So we've talked about three economic indicators. There are, in fact, many other economic indicators that economists will watch. Producer price index is a pricing index that measures the value in wholesale prices, so business prices. Another economic indicator is the prime interest rate, and the prime interest rate is the interest rate that is charged by chartered banks to its best customers. Currently, the prime interest rate in Canada is about 3%, and it's been very stable for a long period of time. Housing starts is another measure of economic activity. This is an, an economic indicator that predicts where we might be headed. For instance, if there's a large number of housing starts, that means there's a lot of construction in the economy, and if there's a lot of new housing starts, might signal lower unemployment, for instance, because companies that are building houses require more construction workers. Other things that we may look at, or economists may look at, is the durable goods orders. So these are orders that are being placed for long-term goods. So it might be new equipment, or might be, from a consumer standpoint, new vehicles and that sort of thing. We're going to talk more of balance of trade as a measure of economic indicator in a future chapter. Inflation rate we've talked about, and the last one is a consumer confidence index, and really it's a measure of the confidence that Canadians have in the economy. So if Canadians are optimistic about the economy, about their having a job, that can itself be a signal as to where the economy is headed. Consumers are confident. That may mean that the economy is building or will enter a strong economic phase. So now that we've learned about the three macroeconomic goals, being GDP growth, low unemployment or high employment in an economy, and stable prices, how does the government go about achieving those things? Because achieving those economic goals can lead to a higher standard of living and quality of life for Canadians. There are really two toolboxes that the Government of Canada has. One is monetary policy, and the other is fiscal policy. And in each of those toolboxes, it really has two tools to use. We talked a little bit about monetary policy in Chapter 17 when we were talking about the Bank of Canada. And sometimes the Bank of Canada will have a contractionary policy. Sometimes it will have an expansionary policy. So the government may have a contractionary policy when the economy is overheated. We're seeing very low unemployment. We're seeing very strong gross domestic product, but as a consequence, we're seeing high inflation. And that high inflation can actually erode the standard of living of Canadians, because many Canadians are on a fixed income, many pensioners, for instance. So it can actually decrease the standard of living in Canada. So contractionary policy will be measures to try and slow down the economy, whereas an expansionary policy, monetary policy, will try to stimulate the economy. So in Chapter 17, we talked about the two tools in that monetary policy toolbox that the Government of Canada will use to stimulate or slow down the economy. You'll recall we talked about one being the overnight rate. And the overnight rate can affect the interest rates in Canada, and thereby affect the level of the money supply in the economy. So for instance, let's say the economy is sluggish, it's slow. We're seeing low gross domestic product, low inflation. We're seeing very high unemployment. So to stimulate the economy, the government might enforce or invoke an expansionary policy where it will try to decrease the overnight rate. By decreasing the overnight rate, it will bring interest rates in the economy down. Lower interest rates will hopefully entice businesses and consumers to take out more loans, take out a bank loan to finance new purchase of equipment or expansion. And when by keeping the interest rates low, that will increase the amount of money supply in the economy because businesses will borrow more money, and will with that money they have, they will go out and buy equipment and that sort of thing, which will stimulate the economy, increase the GDP, reduce unemployment rate, and expand or stimulate the economy. And the opposite is the case when the economy is overheated. If the economy is overheated, high inflation, low unemployment, very high GDP, the government might invoke a contractionary policy where it might increase the interest rates to decrease the supply of money in the economy and cool the economy somewhat. The other tool in the monetary toolbox that the government has is by selling or buying government securities. So if we see a slow economy and the government wants to stimulate the economy, wants to put more money back in the hands of Canadians and businesses. So it might go out to the markets and buy back some of the investments that Canadians have in T-bills and treasury bills. And what that does, by going back to the markets and buying back securities, puts cash in the hands of Canadians and Canadian businesses, so they will have that cash to spend. And conversely, if the economy if there's too much money in the economy, they may invoke a contractionary policy by selling government securities. So those two tools are two of the monetary policy tools that the Government of Canada has. The second toolbox is something that we call fiscal policy. And again, there are two tools in the fiscal policy toolbox that the Government of Canada has. The first is spending and the second is taxation. So the government can control the amount of spending that they make in the economy. For instance, if the economy is sluggish and they want to stimulate the economy, the government might spend more money typically the government will spend more money on infrastructure programs, building new roads, building new schools, to stimulate the construction industry, which would in turn decrease unemployment, which puts more money back in the hands of Canadians, which would lead to higher GDP, and effectively stimulate the economy. So if the economy was overheated, government might spend less to decrease the money supply or slow down the economy. So the government has the advantage of being able to control the amount of spending. Sometimes in periods of prolonged economic decline, the government might every year spend more money than it's bringing in and creating a budget deficit. So you've probably heard that concept in the news. So by creating a deficit, by spending more money than it's bringing in, the government is doing that to try and stimulate the economy. And when times are good, when the economy is very strong, the Government of Canada may reduce its spending and actually have a surplus and reduce the accumulated deficit that the government has. The second tool in the fiscal policy toolbox is something called taxation, which we're all familiar with. So the government can use taxation to stimulate or suppress the economy. For instance, if the economy is sluggish, the 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 federal government might look at ways to reduce taxes. By reducing taxes, it increases the disposable income of Canadians, puts more money into the economy, so that consumers will spend and businesses will spend. Often, those it's not really a decrease in the income tax rates, but more tax incentives. So sometimes we saw during the recession 2008-2009, where the government of Canada offered tax credits programs to those homeowners that were looking at doing home renovations. So instead of reducing personal income tax rates, one way they tried to stimulate the economy is creating tax credit programs, so that for eligible purchases on renovating houses and would stimulate the economy, give more money, would entice consumers to do more home renovation projects and stimulate the construction industry, which would in turn lead to lower unemployment and increased GDP, etc. When the economy is overheated, sometimes the government will implement new taxes or take away some of the tax incentives that businesses and consumers might have. So by controlling the level of taxation in the economy as well, it can stimulate or slow down the economy. I'll post this link for the Bank of Canada video. It's a good video that helps us understand the monetary policy of the Government of Canada. And as you're watching that video, here's some of the questions to think about to make sure you've got a good understanding of monetary policy in Canada and how the Bank of Canada affects it. Here's some other links, and I'll place some bookmarks for these on the Nexus website. So go in, explore a little bit, take a look. If you haven't taken a look at any economic reports, go in, take a look at them. Where's our economy today? Where are we headed? And be able to understand. I think now you'll be able to understand some of those economic indicators and some of the economic forecasts. So some current trends that we're seeing in the markets or in the economy today. We're certainly seeing a little bit of lack of confidence in the securities markets. Consumers are a little bit nervous, not as anxious to take on a lot of new risks in the market. We've seen a lot of countries having some economic problems, Iceland, Europe, the United States. So there's not a lot of the consumer confidence is not all that high right now. Although Canada's been sound and hasn't had the same effects. Globally, people are a little bit cautious about the future and cautious about confidence in the markets. We're also seeing, and will probably continue to see, a lot more competition, particularly in the global markets. The global markets are opening more and more, and so there's a lot more competition for Canadian buyers. So we're starting to see things like more emphasis on relationship management. And relationship management is trying to build long-term relationships with customers, keep customers for a long period of time. So we see a lot of loyalty programs that are cropping up. Everybody's got a loyalty program today. Air Miles and WestJet Miles, and hotels have them, and we get clothing stores offering discounts, Starbucks offering discounts if you continue to buy their products. So we're starting to see a lot of more focus on relationship management to keep customers. We also see some, partnerships or strategic alliances, which are agreements between companies to produce goods and services and team up with each other to look after the economic interests of both parties. We see a lot more partnering. We've seen some partnering with between HP Computers and Walmart. We've seen some partnering in the fast food markets where Tim Hortons might be partnering up with Wendy's, for instance, and that sort of thing, to try and meet the challenges of increased competition in the world today. And we're certainly seeing uh, an increase in entrepreneurship throughout the world. So countries such as China and industry and India are becoming a lot more entrepreneurial, and as a result, there is more competition, more entrepreneurship in the world today as well, and we'll probably continue to see that trend continuing. We'll start to see disappearance of command economies, more movement towards a more mixed economy, or perhaps even a total free enterprise system. So lots of interesting things happening in the world of economics today.